Thanks everyone, and that's a lot to live up to, all these amazing talks the past couple of days. And I will preface this with the fact that I'm not a conservation expert at all, so I might be bringing a slightly different lens to this. I work with the Griffith University Climate Action Beacon, so you would have heard Brendan set the tone about pretty dire situation we're in with climate change, and already on a path to exceeding safe targets. But today I've got the heading of community-based resilience planning, but given all the incredible talks we've had, I've kind of modified that a little bit, and I'm going to talk about a bit of a higher level session and then bring that down into some examples. So hopefully you'll be able to stick with that for the last session of the day. And of course, I'd really love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that we're meeting here today, Turrbal people. I'm from Bundjalung Nation in the Northern Rivers. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I really enjoyed the speakers, the Indigenous speakers here. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. That way. So I just want to quickly go through a couple of key concepts to do with community and resilience. I guess language is a really important part of change, and one of the things I think we need to do is really think about the language we use and how we either reinforce divisions and existing paradigms of the way we engage with nature and environment, and think about how we can come up with some shared language as well. So it's always good to kind of go back to roots and define where we're coming from, what we're talking about. I'll talk a little bit about some key elements of engaging communities in climate action, and then a couple of case studies if we get time. I'll focus on one up in the Torres Strait and a couple of lessons for practice. So in terms of defining community, if you go right back to the etymology of it, the verb communis, which is about public and shared by all or many, we often talk about communities as place-based oriented communities, and that can be at different geographic scales as well. So we might have a little village within Brisbane in a suburb, or even on a street, and that can be a real sense of community, right up to Queensland or Australian. So it's that sense of identity surrounded by the interest in place. But there's also non-place-based communities as well, so thinking about those communities of interest as well, and obviously that's really been supported through the explosion of all sorts of online opportunities to connect internationally, and also these types of conferences as well. But a key thing, I think I'll be talking mostly about the place-based communities today, but a key thing is that communities aren't homogeneous, so they're hugely diverse, and I think when we're engaging communities, that is often the first part that gets dropped off in the way we design our programs for engagement. For resilience, going back to that idea of rebounding or springing back, really key concept in systems thinking, which has really underpinned a lot of the sustainable development paradigm, I guess, and that idea of rebounding, bouncing back from shocks and being able to recover quickly. But again, when we're thinking about community resilience, communities are built of individuals, and they could have physical or mental resilience. And then we've got the resilience of the ecosystems in that community as well. So there's all these interacting elements. So resilience can be quite complex when we're defining that. So just thinking about these as we go through the next few slides. I wanted to bring in a little bit of theory, which the next slide might be a bit scary, but I'll try not to dwell on that. But the idea of transformation. So again, this concept of crossing ecological or social thresholds and having fundamental changes in that system that can able to deal with that change. The idea of transformative governance is a fairly new area in the literature and in studies, and it's often not well defined. So we hear a lot of transformation and transition and all those things being talked about, but often it's a bit blurry around the edges, a bit like sustainable development has been for decades. So just a few ideas here. It's recognising the complexity that's brought in by climate change, that we're not dealing with the same issues now that we were 20, 30 years ago, and that the future is really unknown in terms of what sort of scale of the impacts, where they're going to happen and those sorts of things. Today, I guess the key thing will be around this participatory and deliberative processes, which are really critical to being able to enable that transformation. So this is the scariest slide, hopefully, of the whole thing. So this is a bit of a framework, and I'm not going to dwell on this particular slide, but just to point out, this was developed out of my PhD research, working with remote Indigenous communities, looking at water and energy and community-based resilience in the face of climate change. And the idea at the bottom is that you have these implementation principles that guide a process, which is not that different from a community development kind of step-by-step process. I think we heard a lot in many of the talks about engaging with communities. The first kind of the number one circle up there, I don't know if there's a pointer on here, establishing relationships and building trust. You know, that's really the starting point for any of this work at all, and that takes time as well. So this might not always fit the short-term funding models that we're used to. But I also want to flag that if we're looking at a community governance framework, this can go into the regional scale by that knowledge and knowledge sharing and social learning approach. And really the idea is that we could implement this at a community scale and start building these nodes of resilience, which can, you know, in terms of this theme, connect up across communities, and then we'll have vibrant and healthy regions. So really I just wanted to focus on the principles, and I think a lot of them have been talked about by many of the speakers today. So systemic, many of you might be familiar with systems thinking, really looking at that holistic, you know, socio-ecological, economic kind of interaction. I did want to bring in that in a systemic thinking, it's also very much built on that idea of social construction, that we create the reality that we're in. And so the mental models and the frames that we hold individually and that we collectively reinforce with the language we use and our relationship with each other and nature really also shapes the reality that we're creating. So again, systemic is bringing in meanings, and that's where dialogue and collaboration are really important. You can start talking with communities about what sorts of meanings they associate with different issues that you're addressing. Collaborative dialogue, I think, is fundamental. We've talked about collaboration in a lot of ways, but collaboration is often a term that is bandied about again, but not really well understood about what's needed to make that happen. In a lot of the reviews about what makes collaboration successful in a natural resource management type approach, it's about providing good quality information. It's about having a shared mutual understanding of the issues and an interdependence in the outcomes that you're seeking as well. So having all those factors together create the conditions to have successful collaboration. In social learning, and we heard about that quite a lot in this afternoon session around knowledge sharing and knowledge platforms and those sorts of things. So monitoring and evaluation is really critical. It's not done that great, I wouldn't say. You know, there's a lot to be desired in the way that we continue to collect data, and we heard some really inspiring stories today. But the real gap, I think, is how that is fed back into the system, how communities receive that information and so on. So I really like the idea of the knowledge platform that you guys are developing for bush heritage as well. Strategic and nested. Communities don't operate in isolation. Again, we've got individuals, communities, regions, national and international level as well. So thinking about how each of those influence the community is a really important part, and coordination across those scales, whether that's policy or agencies or knowledge sharing and data and those sorts of things as well. And the final principle is really about strengths-based, which was raised earlier, which is fantastic. Appreciation of existing strengths. Again, there's particularly in, say, climate adaptation, there's a lot of people come to it from a vulnerability perspective, which you can understand because you're looking at climate vulnerability. But I think it's different when you're dealing with communities. You need to identify what those strengths are. So I just wanted to talk about a case study from some work we'd done up in Mapoon, in Cape York, in Ali Karang in the Central Deserts, and also in Masig and Hammond Island up in the Torres Strait, really looking about how communities can experience sustainable water and energy. So it's a little bit separated from the landscape sort of connectivity that we've been talking about, but really critical in these communities because it's the enabler for them to engage in, tourism activities, in having healthy lifestyles and those sorts of things. It's a very challenging context in a lot of these remote communities. You have everything's pretty much on diesel generation, although there's a bit of transition happening at the moment with renewables, but probably not quick enough for my liking. In the Torres Strait, for example, they rely on desalinated water systems, which are highly energy intensive and have funny taste, as we've been told. And then you have these big reservoirs as well. All of these challenges, remote Australia has small populations, very diverse, and it costs a lot to supply water. So that's subsidised by government. So there's a real interest in making these systems efficient and affordable. But with climate change, it's affecting both supply of energy, because it's often diesel shipped in by truck or by barge, and I guess with the water systems as well, water tables are getting salinated as well, and unseasonal rainfall. So in terms of that systemic principle, we used a whole range of different quantitative and qualitative methods with the community. We sat down first with them to talk about what they wanted out of the project. We were invited to be there, and so that was really important to work with the leadership. We did a whole bunch of surveys to really understand what was going on, and I wanted to talk quickly about a community capitals assessment because I thought that was really highlighted some of the additional issues that were going on in the community. I think up in Masig and a lot of the Torres Strait Island Regional Council, they look after the 15 outer communities. They probably not, most Australians don't realise that some of them have been on water restrictions, which actually means turning off water 15 hours a day, been like that for up to 10 years in some communities, and that's their management strategy. And that's based on the fact that there's not really a better way of engaging communities in how they can supply and use that water, and there's very high water use in those communities as well. So we did a co-design session, and people were looking at water efficiency. We had a whole bunch of barbecues and chats, and we provided feedback to the community as well. But sitting down and talking with people individually really highlighted the connectivity between the issues of public housing, of not really having access to financial capital, I guess how water and energy were prioritised. Amongst other things, they really wanted to be able to have employment and opportunities to keep their kids in the communities as well. So there's a real I guess this sort of methodology highlights how you can bring in opportunities for the community by doing the management much better. With the overuse of water as well, it highlighted that although there's a lot of high outdoor water use, that a lot of this was for cultural practices and to keep culture alive in the community as well, and for very valid reasons. It wasn't just water wastage, as was kind of the assumption. And that had prompted a whole bunch of kind of stick approaches to engaging the community, which was to go around house by house and say, use less water, which was kind of been going on for many years. So gathering that broader understanding. So the results really highlighted that complexity, that, at fault or at root was really a lack of governance coordination and I guess, some of the management techniques weren't actually resulting in the outcomes that they had hoped as well. and that interconnectedness of water, energy, public health, and the landscape as well, the ability to be able to continue fishing and doing their cultural practices and keeping their kids in the community as well. So from that work, we've got a new ARC linkage project kicking off early next year, and we're really excited about that because that's actually going to be co-design and going into a lot more about the digital toolbox and co-designing those activities using Indigenous knowledge and Western science. So I won't go into these now because I've run out of time, but we're applying these themes to other areas as well in the Tweed Coast, and on the Gold Coast we've been working in creative engagement to look at how we can engage communities in that resilience planning as well. So there are some challenges, I would say differences in language and meaning, and I mean that not just cross-culturally, but in terms of working with engineers and social scientists and, within and across communities as well. Building trust is a really key one, especially when you're working in Indigenous communities. It takes time and you really need to follow protocols. And I'd say that the next steps would really need to build up skills in this kind of connectivity work, which is facilitating groups in creating spaces for collaborative dialogue and those sorts of things as well. So I think, keen to continue trialling this kind of framework approach and what that looks like in practice that's using evidence-based research, and we're looking to develop a knowledge hub, which again is not that dissimilar to what you were talking about before. And also the youth aspect as well. So we'll be looking at that intergenerational justice aspect as well. So bringing in young people because they're the ones who are going to have the impacts mostly. So thank you very much for your time. I'll leave it there. Thanks.